Well, look, it's historic. I mean, he is the longest serving leader of a party in Senate history, which is pretty amazing. It's been around 2 decades. I think it was late in George W. Bush. I'll have to check, but he's been a senator for 40 years, but he's been the leader almost 2 decades. I think so. It's a historic. He's been a historic figure for better or worse, depending on your political leanings. Over the last 20 years, he's been one of the key figures in the fights. I would say the way I will remember Mitch McConnell is potentially the last of a dying breed, which is the old school Republican establishment figure. He is like the avatar for that. And it's clear that he hates Trump and Trump hates him. I mean, everybody knows that. He has become kind of the de facto leader in Congress of the old school pushback against Trump wing. And it hasn't gone very well for him for the most part because what you have seen is the party has purged itself of the people like Mitch McConnell. They've either lost in primaries or general elections or just retired. And the old school conservatives, and I want to be clear on this because from a policy standpoint, and I say this about Haley and Trump, and I think the same applies to McConnell and Trump, there's not a huge gap between, the policies that Trump and his MAGA wing prefer and the policies that McConnell prefer. But there is some gap, and that gap often centers around foreign policy and America's place in the world, and you see it right now with Ukraine. McConnell's one of the old school, and this is where I am, people who think America should work to encourage democracy around the world, not with U.S. troops, but with money and arms, and we should help fight people like Putin in Ukraine by sending the Ukrainians arms, and that America, the world's a better place when America leads. And that's kind of at odds with the America First MAGA movement. So McConnell in some ways could be seen as kind of one of the last of that breed, at least in that position of power. And he had the power and he controlled the Senate Republicans for a long time. And that's starting to slip. And you saw that with Ukraine. You've seen people like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, younger guns in the Senate who are more aligned with the MAGA movement, openly calling him out and calling for new leadership. He was challenged after the last election. He still won, but he was challenged within the Republican conference. Also, side note, just like Biden and Trump, he's really old. As he mentioned in a speech today, he just turned 82. He obviously had the health issues where he froze up in public a couple of times last year. So this isn't just the party's changing and he's with the old faction. It's also he's been around a long time. He's got a lot of enemies. He's really old. In terms of what he did, I will say this about Mitch McConnell. He was a voice of reason. A few weeks ago on this, I talked about how, quoting the line from Succession, that Republicans in the House are not serious people. The MAGA hardcore. I'm not talking about every Republican in the House. I mean the Marjorie Taylor Greens, the House Freedom Caucus people, the people who have now a lot of power within the party and kind of march to Donald Trump's orders. They're not serious about governing. They're more burn the house down and we'll deal with the consequences later. That was not Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell stood in opposition to that. And most of the time, Mitch McConnell won those fights. Most of the time, he avoided the crazy stuff, the government shutdowns, the defaults on our debt. He was one of the central players negotiating the deals that avoided those things most of the time. And he's continuing to do that now. Also, on some of the bipartisan things that have passed under the Biden administration, the Chips and Science Act, the transportation bill. McConnell was one of the Republicans, the 10 to 20 Republicans that voted for those things. On the other hand, I mean, he was a partisan, right? One of probably his most lasting legacy is the Supreme Court. People talk about Trump getting the 3 justices on the Supreme Court, but that would not have happened without Mitch McConnell, because if you recall, Antonin Scalia died when Barack Obama was president. He died suddenly. And it was in the last year of Obama's term. And McConnell was the Senate Majority Leader. And he just said, I'm not going to hold a hearing for Merrick Garland, who's now the Attorney General, who was Obama's choice to replace Scalia. He said, I'll wait and see what happens in the election. And of course, what happened? Trump won. The next year, that the Senate approved, confirmed Neil Gorsuch. So you replace Scalia with another conservative when it would have been Merrick Garland, a liberal. And then a few years later, you had a similar situation when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died in the final year of Trump's term. And this time McConnell flipped and he said, no, I am going to hold a hearing. And they very quickly pushed through and confirmed Amy Coney Barrett, which flipped that seat from a liberal justice to a conservative. And that led to, a few years later, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, among other conservative decisions. So whether you agree or disagree with that outcome, there is no one other than maybe arguably Donald Trump who is more influential in shaping a conservative majority on the court than Mitch McConnell. So he gets credit or blame for that, depending on how you look at it. Now, to be fair to him, he did make the distinction that in 2008 you had you had divided government, and in 2020 you had a Senate and a White House of the same party. So however you view that. I will say this. In general, I think McConnell was a stabilizing figure, but I think my biggest beef with him personally is after January 6th. On that day, he was great. He was one of the people who came back and gave a fiery speech on the Senate floor late that night, like at 2 a.m. on January 7th, after the rioters had been cleared out, and basically said, you're not going to stop us from doing what we need to do to move forward. We're not going to let, the rioters win, essentially. And they certified the election results. And he was rightly very critical of Trump. But when it came to the impeachment a few weeks later, it was close. Like, there were, I think, 7 Republicans that voted to convict him in the Senate. And if McConnell would have come out hard for conviction and tried to persuade other people, you may have gotten there. You may have gotten to the 67 votes, which is what you needed to convict Trump. But what would that have meant? That would have meant that he could not run again in 2024. And we could have avoided the prospect of having another Donald Trump presidency. And McConnell, in his speech, said, I'm not going to vote for conviction, but he's guilty, is basically what he said. I mean, I think his line was, he's morally responsible for what happened on January 6th. His actions essentially led to it. And he probably should be convicted, but I'm not going to vote to convict him. And we all know why he didn't, because he didn't want to take the gamble as the leader of the Republican Party to be on the losing side of an effort to convict a Republican president in an impeachment trial. He thought that could cost him his job and his power. So that's my biggest criticism of Mitch McConnell, is when decisions like that came up, where it was his power versus the good of the country, I think he blinked. And I wish he wouldn't have done that in that moment, because that would have been the way to keep Trump off the ballot. It's not this Colorado decision of throwing him off the ballot with the 14th Amendment. That's going to be struck down by the Supreme Court. But the way to do it is through the political system. And McConnell had a moment there where he could have tried to lead that effort, and he blinked.
Don't you think that was more about decorum? And I say that because I'm thinking along the lines of Ford pardoning Nixon. It was almost like, we know he did this, but for the good of the country, we're going to let him slide. Now, I'm not a Mitch McConnell fan. I wonder, though, if you asked him and if he told you the truth, I think at the time he probably felt Donald Trump's political career was over anyway. Don't you think? Regardless of conviction. And I feel like that was
I
okay. He
do.
was a
I think he
president.
and many other
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think he and many other Republicans felt that way, and that's one of the reasons they voted to acquit. I think what they actually said, though, was, I think McConnell, I don't even remember exactly, but I think his reasoning was, well, Trump is out of office now, and it would be kind of unprecedented to convict someone of something they did when they're no longer in office. I think that was the justification he used. But really, the honest answer was, they thought Trump was done. Trump was at his lowest point. Even like hardcore Republicans, if you recall that moment in history, kind of shook their head and was like, well, that's too much. Like, this is a little bit too far. This guy's pretty toxic. And it looked like he was probably done. And I think you're right. That's why they did it. But of course, you can't assume that. And that's why you should do it based on the merits. And the merits were Trump clearly. Again, criminal liability, which is what he'll hopefully go to trial for later this year, is a different issue, right? I'm not sure about that. I have an open mind, but his crime at base level was political. It was a dereliction of duty. And that was how it should have been handled. The House was right to impeach him. The Senate had a chance to convict him, and Mitch McConnell could have led that effort. He was strong at that point. Trump was weak, and he chose not to do it.
And you mentioned the Supreme Court. Democrats will call it stealing 2 seats. Now, if you look at it, what should have been done, in my opinion, if you're being fair, you just do the same thing each time. So really, it was stealing 1 seat because if you're not going to go ahead and confirm Garland, which I'm okay with, but then you can't go ahead and confirm Amy Coney Barrett. You have to do it, in my opinion, the same time both parties. So there's obviously one Supreme Court seat that Democrats look upon as being stolen. It's funny too because for Mitch McConnell, he did always come across as this guy who is just in charge. And I was never necessarily a fan of Mitch McConnell's, but it's weird how during the Trump era, there's a lot of things like there's a lot of Trump's policies that I agree with. What I don't like about the Trump era, what I think has happened to the Republican Party, is what you've mentioned several times about not being serious people and not really governing. So it's kind of funny because I would throw Mitch McConnell in a bucket, and I'm not saying they're all exactly the same, but there's folks like Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney and just like the Bush family, which for years you thought were the enemies if you're a Democrat. And then once Trump came along, even if you agree with a lot of Trump's policies, the way he goes about it and also just the conspiracy theory stuff, the fact that you can never admit you're wrong, the fact that you don't pass legislation that's good for the country just for politics. That's where in the last couple of years I was kind of like, Mitch McConnell, he's not that bad. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, McConnell believed in, I think, the base level of what politics is, which is it's the art of the possible. Like if you ever listen to McConnell talk, he would often talk about how can we get a result. I mean, he would literally use words like result. Like who talks like that? He does, because that's, regardless of political philosophy, what he was interested in is getting as much as he could to advance the agenda that he wanted to advance, which you may agree or disagree with, and take the win when you can get it. And that this latest immigration deal was a perfect example. That was Mitch McConnell behind the scenes. He wasn't the one in the room negotiating it. It was James Langford, a conservative senator from Oklahoma, but McConnell picked Langford to do that. And the reason McConnell did that is because he said Biden is unpopular right now. People are pissed at the border. He wants this money for Ukraine, which Mitch McConnell did too. I think we can get him to agree to pretty conservative immigration reforms that he never normally would agree to and use the Ukraine aid as leverage. And he was right. Biden was willing to do that. It took months to negotiate, but the Biden administration and the Democrats were willing to agree to things that they had not previously been willing to agree to, especially for nothing in return when it came to amnesty or legalization status for people here. So McConnell played, as he usually does, his cards perfectly, had a deal that would have given him not just what he wanted on Ukraine, but what he wanted on immigration. It wasn't everything that he and Republicans wanted, but it would have been a big win. And he played that deal. And in years past, he probably would have won. That deal would have probably passed and he would have gotten that result. But he didn't. And the reason he didn't was because Donald Trump came out against it and blocked it. And then everyone in Congress, not everyone, but the conservatives in Congress who support Trump fell in line. And that was a perfect illustration of how the power has shifted. McConnell's old school power of take what we can get, use our leverage, and take the deal against Trump's more purity. We're only going to get what we want. And you're right. That is what is leading the Republicans right now, especially in the House, but even, as I say, more so in the Senate, is this idea that here's what we want, and we're only going to get a deal if we get 90% plus of what we want. And that's not how a narrowly divided country like ours worked. And Mitch McConnell, at a fundamental level, understood that that's what politics is. You fight like hell, and then you make a deal and you take what you can get. And as people like McConnell leave, what are you left with? You're left with more and more people like Ted Cruz and Mike Lee and Josh Hawley in the Senate and the Marjorie Taylor Greene and the Freedom Caucus and in the House and Jim Jordan and people like that. And that's scary. That's one of the things I will say about Trump's first term is Trump was largely to a large degree, up until the election of 2020, he was kept in check. And he was kept in check against a lot of his worst instincts by people in his administration, like Bill Barr and General Kelly, these kind of like old school politicians who were seen as respected figures in the conservative movement. And also Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan, who was the Speaker of the House for a while. These were the people that were kind of like, okay, you can go here, but you can't go here. The scary thing about a Donald Trump second term, if it happens, is he's not gonna appoint any of those people like Bill Barr and his administration, and the people like Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan aren't going to be there in the Congress. And it's going to be more people like Trump. And some of the guardrails that were in place for those 4 years where Trump was president aren't going to be there if he's president again.
I think also folks our age look at Mitch McConnell. I don't want to say poster child. First of all, he's very old, but also he's not the number one guy I think of when I think of this. But when he froze up a couple times, and the fact that I feel like he's been leading government my entire life, I think he's one of the poster children for these career politicians stay in power too long. And I could throw a bunch of them at you. And not all of them have the same senior moments like McConnell, but I would throw Pelosi, Schumer, McConnell, Biden. I feel like, I'm 41 years old. I feel like they've been in politics ever since I've known what politics are. And
They
so
have.
folks that stay right, folks that stay too long and literally sometimes die in office or in their seats, like a Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a Dianne Feinstein, where they have to tell her what's going on, Mitch McConnell freezing up, Joe Biden falling down. The fact that we're in our 40s and we feel like everybody, whether it's Trump, whether it's Bernie, whether it's Biden, whether it's Pelosi, Schumer, all these folks are 75 to 80 years old. I feel like McConnell is in that group of people that were like, dude, you've just been doing this way too long. Like, step aside, give some other folks, some other generations. How about some other generations of people a chance to lead this country?
Yeah, I think McConnell actually mentioned that in his speech today about turning it over a new generation. I think there's two ways to look at that, right? The argument against what you're saying, which I think has some credence, is that Mitch McConnell take away the freezing in public, right? That was scary. It was related to a fall he had and some seizures. Not a lot of people have argued that he hasn't been, up until very recently, incredibly effective at his job. You may hate Mitch McConnell and you may
Mhm.
dislike his policies, but there aren't people who say Mitch McConnell wasn't an effective political operator. I mean,
Right.
Republican, Democrat, everybody said he was the consummate politician in terms of his skill and ability as a politician. Same thing with Nancy Pelosi. Again, agree or disagree. What she was able to get done when she was the speaker, even in her late 70s and 80 years old. I think she's like 83 now, and she's no longer obviously the leader, but that just changed last year. What she was able to do, whether you liked her or not, nobody disagreed with her ability. With Biden, it seems like it's a little bit different, right? Because although he's been a pretty good president, I think we are starting to question his abilities, especially as it comes to a campaigner, if not in his day-to-day job. So I think having people in Congress a long time is not in and of itself bad. What is because and in fact it can be good, because what it does is the presidencies become so powerful. If you go back through American history, it wasn't always this way. The presidency over time, Republican and Democrat, have taken more and more power. And you need a strong Congress to balance that out. That's what our system's based on. Checks and balances, three branches of government, co-equal, all with different powers. So in order for Congress to really exert those powers, you need people who know what the hell they're doing. You need adults in the room. And Pelosi and McConnell, again, agree or disagree with their political philosophies, they were that. So I have no problem with people sticking around for a long time and gaining power and influence. My problem is age. And it's not a perfect way to cut it off, because there are some people obviously very effective at older ages than others. But I think when you get to a certain age, that you should no longer hold these positions. And I've said before on this podcast, I think 80 to me is when you cut it off. Like, you can serve up until you're 80, but the day you turn 80, it's time. You know, and you can't just leave it to these people to make that decision on their own because, as you pointed out, you run into the possibility of a situation like Dianne Feinstein where they're wheeling her onto the Senate floor, literally telling her how to vote.
And just so people know, I was reading the article. So Mitch McConnell stepping down from leadership, but he's not stepping away. He will fulfill his term through 2027, which I think is kind of funny. It's like I'm probably too old to lead the Senate, but I'm still going to be one of 100
I'm going to be
senators,
in
which
the
is kind of
Senate,
funny.
right?
Right.